Welcome to Lifelong Learning on ReachMD. I'm your host, Alicia Sutton, and we're broadcasting from the annual meeting of the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions. And we're going to talk about an interesting evolution of a teaching model called the flipped classroom. With me is Brian McGowan. He's Chief Learning Officer at ArcheMedx, based in Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome, Brian. Good to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a little buzz out there about the flipped classroom. You want to tell us about that?
About the buzz or the flipped classroom?
Probably about the classroom.
The flipped classroom model is a pretty simple approach in the truest sense. So although much more is made of it than it probably deserves, the idea is that in most cases, learners come to a live session with extreme variability in life experiences and what they know, in their preparation. Likewise, the educator may not necessarily know each of the learners separately. They may have a general idea of what the learners are. So traditionally, that's the environment 5 minutes before a session begins. The session begins, the faculty member talks to the fattest part of the curve, assuming that there's a homogeneity there that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. The flipped classroom is an approach that suggests that if we can somehow use a blended learning model, which isn't necessarily buzzworthy, but if we can figure out a way to get the learners somehow prepared and engaged before they arrive at the live session, then while the faculty and the learners are together for those critical moments, an hour or 2 hours, the critical time where they're directly relating to one another, that time can be used for application of knowledge, and that the pre-work, the flipped part, that the part that comes before, could be used for the acquisition of knowledge.
So it sounds like it's more than just saving a little bit of upfront time that's often spent with the instructor saying, hey, let me get a sense of what you guys know. It really changes the education in the room. So do you have some examples of how it's been used?
Sure. It's from K through 12 through higher ed and increasingly in medical schools. I know several stories of medical schools that have tried this. There's actually, I think at this point I've collected maybe 30 or 40 publications of the flipped classroom being applied in healthcare professional education of one sort or the other. What's interesting is the flipped classroom model tends to create not only continuity in the learning experience, so these learners are going to engage in this content beforehand, and that same group of learners is then going to be placed in front of me as a facilitator, not necessarily a lecturer anymore, but now I'm a facilitator at the live meeting. And so there's continuity. The learners and the facilitators, the educational planners, are now kind of, they're joined at the hip for a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. In continuing education, like what we're hearing in many of the sessions here in Dallas, that's not normally the way we operate in continuing education. There's not necessarily an expectation that there's continuity in the educational process. The episodic types of education, you go to a website one day, you go to a different website the other day, your society provides you education, but maybe then you're at a different meeting with a different association. That lack of continuity in continuing education actually serves as a bit of a barrier for implementation of something like the flipped classroom. So in those cultures that are more closely structured, undergraduate residency programs, even specialty societies where maybe all those clinicians are used to gathering together, the flipped classroom seems to have at some point we'll stop referring to it as a flipped classroom. We'll refer to this as this blended learning model, but it seems to have proven itself quite valuable in those settings.
So you've built some of these with your company along with other educational providers. What have you learned along the way that either about the learner in this environment or the instructor in this environment? What are you seeing?
So we've done this now 2 different times with hundreds of learners in each instance where we've made this continuity. We've built this pre-work. We've created these video series. And the approach that we've taken is quite in that kind of mainstream of what the flipped classroom is. We want them to learn enough about some information. We want all of them to learn about the same information, so people are coming to us with a a more unified understanding. And then we can learn from their learning experience, and we can build application exercises during these learning labs. It's the learning from the learning experience that is universally, of everything that we've learned, it's the number one lesson to take away from this. The continuity of the learning process is only as valuable as your ability to actually measure and sample at different steps in the process.
And technically, how is it that the instructor learns something about the student before they walk in?
In many ways, it's largely dependent on the technology that they choose to use for that pre-work. So there's certainly instances, and I don't begrudge them in any way, that you could shoot a bunch of videos with web cameras of 3 or 4 faculty members, post them to YouTube, create a YouTube playlist, send your learners to YouTube, and at the end of the day, you'll know that this video got 23 views and this video got 30 views.
But what are you learning about the learner? I mean, that's certainly...
Nothing in that instance, unfortunately. But very inexpensive, and it can be done with almost no budget, a little bit more work than maybe the traditional educational program.
Sure.
What we've done, so the company that I'm Chief Learning Officer of, we've actually supported several of these flipped classrooms, some of which I've been faculty member on and some I haven't. And in those instances, the types of learning analytics that we're able to gather, I felt at chairing some of these sessions fundamentally changes what we can do at the live meeting. So I can give you some examples of that.
Yeah, please.
So in one instance, we had 12 videos. These are 12 separate building blocks in the overarching curriculum. So you can think of the educational planning process. So we built these building blocks out. Not only did we know a week before the live meeting which of the videos were most engaging, were driving the greatest traffic, not only could we tell exactly how many learners had seen each of the videos, but the architecture that we've built actually allows the learner to take notes while they're engaging with the videos, allows them to ask questions of the faculty through the architecture, and it allows them to search through a library of what the faculty have felt are the key related resources that support this specific building block in the curriculum.
Interesting.
So by 72, 96 hours before the educational planners are standing in front of that room for that critical 1 or 2 hours where you're face-to-face and you can have impact, we knew which were the resources that were most important. We knew which areas in this building block curriculum the learners were most comfortable or least comfortable with. And now, instead of walking into that live experience blind or assuming that we knew about the learners, we could build our application scenarios to make sure that Alicia got the one thing that she was most comfortable. That builds her self-efficacy. She feels like she can deliver. She knows that this is something that she's got to strengthen. And we could also build from the 1 or 2 areas where she was uncomfortable, and that really brought those areas of weakness up. That type of individualized learning can't be done it can't be done effectively in the type of episodic, the episodic learning
No, it's
environment.
Interesting. If you're just joining us, this is Lifelong Learning on ReachMD, and I'm talking with Brian McGowan, Chief Learning Officer at ArcheMedx, and we're talking about blended learning, or the flipped classroom, as I like to say. So, Brian, are there any risks in this model? Can you go into some of those for us?
Sure. The basic premise of the flipped classroom is that learners will do pre-work, and that you'll learn about the learners, and that you can make basic assumptions when they get into the live experience, this critical live experience, that there's a homogeneity of the learners, right? So by putting the work in to prepare this learning opportunity before they get in the room, that comes with some assumptions from the educational planner's perspective. So what would happen if you put all this energy in to create these moments, and you promoted them to your audience, or you assigned them to your class, and 24 hours, 48 hours before you went to do this application part of the experience, you found out that no one had seen them, right? What if you don't have the relationship with the learners that actually drives them to participate? Well, that's an extreme, right? No one walks into your room, and in essence, you planned education, you have no data, you're back to what you would have, the exact situation you would have been when you normally held a live program.
Right.
But what about the in-between point? What about when 50% of the learners complete the pre-work. 50% of the workers have put the time in, they're dedicated, they've done this, their knowledge levels have risen, there's a sense of homogeneity that you can maybe apply to the group, but now you've got 50% of the learners who haven't done any of it. Now you're sitting in a scenario where you've architected this live learning experience with these assumptions that you're going to have a homogeneous group, and 50% of the people that walk in your room, they're going to be lost 5 minutes in, or worse yet, you've got to go back to lecture style. And the 50% of the people that did the work are going to walk into your classroom and say, we already did this. Why are you spending the first half of our program teaching us exactly what we already watched? So I think what's really essential in this, especially for folks that are piloting these types of blended or flip approaches early on, what's really critical is that you have the plasticity to think on your feet and adapt. We were really lucky in the classes that we ran, in the flipped programs that we ran, is that we were working with societies that had a very strong relationship with their members. The members were very engaged.
They were engaged, yeah.
And
motivated.
We made sure that 4 weeks before we released the videos, 3 weeks before we communicated that the videos were great, we created short little videos that we put into the email saying, come listen to Dr. So-and-so give this talk. And we really focused energy and some time on making sure that we were telling the story about why this is valuable to the learners. So by the time we got to the classroom, 80% of those who were registered for this live learning lab, 80% of them had participated in the videos. And of those 80%, nearly 80% had done all the videos. So we're talking about more than 100 learners and over 870 views of these short 6-minute to 8-minute videos, engagement with notes and reminders, thousands of different actions that we could track.
That's interesting. What was the topic area on that one?
So in the latest 2 instances, it was focused on the educators themselves, the folks that educate healthcare professionals. And each of the building blocks of the curriculum was around a specific area of the science of education. So constructivist theory and connectivist theory, adult learning theory. And we had experts from this community, from the Alliance community, who had done research in each of these areas or were currently doing their doctoral dissertations in these areas. And we coached them so that they could deliver a concise 8 to 10 minute lesson about what the average educator would need to know, just so in the back of their mind as they're planning education and they're making decisions, they're thinking, is there any ground for me to stand on when I make that decision? Right.
You know, at this conference, we're surrounded by very, very smart educators, creative educators, who you and I both have seen come up with curriculum design that's quite enticing. Does this change that paradigm a little bit? They have to think about their education design differently.
I think this gets to this kind of underlying idea of data-driven education, right? So the blended learning model, the flipped classroom in its essence, because you're connecting pieces, you can either connect them in a preordained fashion. So you're not going to learn anything about the learners. You're going to give them content, and you're going to plan their live meeting, and it's a flipped classroom, but everything's preordained. None of it is agile. None of it's based on formative assessment. None of it's refined. The content doesn't breathe, and if you're perfect in your planning process, then maybe the education comes out perfect. I've yet to meet an educator who's perfectly planned an educational program, especially not one as complex as over 100 individuals from separate institutions with disparate experience from 1 year in the business to 20 years in the educational business, and think that they're going to get it right the first time. But the flipped classroom actually gives you the opportunity. If you measure effectively and you collect the right data, you now have the data that should give you the opportunity to do all those leading, most innovative educational designs: agile, individual, adaptive. These are the topics that should be paramount in our educational planning process. But without the data, you can't be agile, you can't be adaptive, you can't be individualized. We tend to believe that we can plan something perfectly in the beginning and measure it at the end.
Yeah.
And if you were perfect, then you can get good data at the end, maybe. But it's not the experience that most of us have had. And if you're not looking into your data often enough, and you're not building a process that allows you to update and agilely, refined content, then there's so much invested. Our people's careers, their professional careers, not to mention hundreds of millions of dollars, are focused on that critical education and support of the healthcare community.
Right.
And, the idea that you're going to build an educational program and someone's going to walk away and say, I learned one thing, and we're going to see that as a triumph, just seems like there's a slight inefficiency there.
It does.
I think the future of data-driven science, the future of these types of blended and continual learning processes, I think that's where we have to go.
That's
and I
where
think
we're
we
going.
now have enough evidence to suggest that
It seems that way.
we've got the competency and the technology to do so.
Yeah, it seems so. So do you have some final parting thoughts, some key takeaways from your presentation today that you'd like to share with the listeners here about blended learning?
Sure. I think there should be acceptance that from every meta review of the efficacy of education, sequential, continual, multi-method education is the education that drives knowledge transfer and drives performance change. So at its core, on the shoulders of giants, we know that blended or flipped classroom is the most well-grounded approach, and the combination between online, case-based, and live, problem-based, is we know that works. What we're really going to have to take from these experiences, the recent publication we've had in the Journal for Continuing Education in Nursing, is that model is really only as good as the data that you have that allows each of the pieces to build on each other.
Right.
Right. So there's a lot of science, and the flipped classroom is an entirely logical and evidence-based approach.
Sounds like it.
But it can still be done poorly.
Yeah.
Right. So making sure that you've got the right data, and then the final piece of it is having the data is only as valuable as your ability, the resources that you have to make sure you can act on that data.
Right.
And in many ways, pulling data from all these online pre-working learning experiences, and then in 72 to 96 hours before a live session, changing maybe everything that you thought you should do may not be right for everybody.
It may not. It takes
Right.
a little learning on the educator side for sure.
It takes adaptability for sure.
Yeah. Brian, thank you. Very insightful, and we always have a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your time.
You've been listening to Lifelong Learning on ReachMD, the channel for medical professionals. This series is co-produced with the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions. For more information and a full library of medical broadcasts, please visit reachmd.com. I'm your host, Alicia Sutton, and we'll see you next time.